So previously in our Five Nights at Freddy's character concept series, we've gone through a number of different themed pizzerias. Each of these pizzerias was home to a whole cast of creepy animatronic characters. All of these characters were hell-bent on attacking the Night Guard. But throughout this series, each of our different Night Guards has done their best to survive night after night. But now we come to a brand new pizzeria in the Freddy Fazbear Entertainment family. This pizzeria in particular was quite special. The pizzeria was made in partnership with another company. This in fact was one of the only times that Fazbear Entertainment has done this. And the company they partnered with to make the special pizzeria was Playtime Co. The two companies came together to make Poppy's Pizzeria. This was a pizzeria that was themed after all the famous toys that were designed by Playtime Co. The toys that they created were always popular with children, so it only made sense to marry the fun and whimsical nature of Freddy Fazbear with the excitement and fun of Playtime Co. But the theme of the pizzeria was only the beginning. The real main attraction was the fully animatronic characters. Each and every one was modelled after a specific Playtime Co character, and the first character we're starting off with is the most popular one of all. And that would of course be Huggy Wuggy. Huggy Wuggy was designed after their toy counterpart. He was given his signature blue colour scheme with yellow hands and feet, and of course his big red lips. The animatronic version also has long limbs just like the toy as well. The only noticeable difference are the signature animatronic eyes. The engineers chose these eyes to give them a little more character and make them look more lively. But the workers would soon realise they would all become a little too lively as time went on. So in the production process of these animatronics, both Playtime Co and Fazbear Entertainment had a hand in designing these characters. Of course, Fazbear Entertainment had a role in building the internal mechanics, and Playtime Co designed and manufactured the outer skins and shells. Although there was a strange request from Playtime Co that Fazbear Entertainment has never seen before. They requested that each of these animatronics have a version of their own toy embedded into their endoskeleton. But it couldn't just be any old version of Huggy Wuggy. It had to be a special one that was sent over from the factory. This process was done with great secrecy. No one really knew why this was so important. Something about a bonded toy, whatever that meant. So in the end, they just let Playtime Co do as they wish and implant the special toy in each of the animatronics. So at Poppy's Pizzeria, there were a number of fun attractions linked with all the toys. And we'll get into all of them in a later video when we introduce all the other characters. But for now, let's look at Huggy's role at the pizzeria. So, just like all the other characters at any Fazbear Pizzeria establishment, the Playtime characters would also perform up on stage. Huggy's role up on stage was that of the main singer. He would stand up on stage with all the other characters and sing their jolly birthday tunes. Huggy was considered to be one of the most popular characters at Poppy's Pizzeria. All the guests loved him and would always demand to see him. Apart from singing up on stage, Huggy would also roam around the party and eating area. He would greet all the guests and rattle off a couple of catchphrases here and there.
Does someone need a hug? I promise I won't bite. I'll squeeze you until you...
But the main feature of Huggy Wuggy was in the name. Huggy was designed to actually hug the guests. All the customers loved getting hugs from Huggy. Half the day was spent taking photos of the big blue animatronic giving hugs. But as one staff member would soon realise, Huggy's hugs would be much tighter and deadlier than they were expecting. So now let's meet our new Night Guard character for Poppy's Pizzeria. So our new Night Guard's name is Chris. He's been working at the Poppy Pizzeria for a couple of months now, and as far as he's concerned, it's a pretty easy job. All he's got to do is keep an eye on the cameras and look out for any suspicious activity. Fazbear Entertainment has always had a bad reputation, but Chris the Night Guard didn't see any problem with working there. Out of all the pizzerias he could have worked at, he was most excited to work at the Poppy Pizzeria. Ever since he was a little boy, he owned all the Playtime Co toys, and with no surprise, Huggy Wuggy was his favourite. So Chris had a deep connection with this pizzeria. He loved being surrounded by the giant versions of all his beloved toys. But he would soon realise that it wouldn't be all it's cracked up to be. So now let's get into the unfortunate incident surrounding Huggy Wuggy. So after hours, one of the employees was cleaning up after a big day of children's parties. There was confetti and pizza crusts all over the floors. And unfortunately, they were chosen to clean it all up. Whilst doing so, they came across Huggy Wuggy. He was just standing there. It seemed that he was shut off for the day to conserve power. The worker stared at Huggy and remembered how they too used to have a Huggy Wuggy doll of their own. They decided while no one was looking that they would give him a hug. They wrapped their arms around Huggy and all of a sudden he sprung to life. Huggy activated and wrapped his long arms around the worker. At first this gave the worker quite a fright, but then they thought to themselves that this was probably in their programming. For a short while it was actually nice to be hugged by their childhood toy. But eventually Huggy wouldn't let go. And then after that Huggy started hugging tighter. Second by second, the pressure from Huggy's hydraulic arms grew tighter and tighter. The worker could hardly even breathe. They struggled to get out, but nothing was working. Huggy's hug was just getting tighter and tighter. Eventually there was so much pressure that the worker was in searing pain. They thought to themselves that they must have cracked a rib or two. They needed to escape Huggy's grip, or they'd surely be squeezed till there was nothing left of them. The worker scratched and clawed at Huggy to do anything they could to try and escape. In the process, they damaged Huggy quite a bit. His hydraulic arms squeezed so tight that they started leaking oil all over his mechanic joints. Eventually, with enough struggle, Huggy finally let go. The worker ran away to quickly call an ambulance. Huggy just stood there in their withered state. They never knew that they could hug like that before. It felt good. They wanted to hug another person just like that, but even tighter next time. Maybe they could even make someone pop. Moments later, Huggy was overwhelmed with a twisted presence. This wasn't the same Huggy anymore. Something had changed about them. A much darker version of themselves has been awakened, and he decided the next person he would hug would be the night guard. So now let's get to the gameplay segment of the video. So the player would take on the role of Chris the night guard. He would be stationed in the security office and need to keep a lookout for all the animatronic characters. The security office would be the basic layout. There would be a left and right door, and a monitor with the live camera footage for all the locations. So Huggy's starting location would be in the party area. As soon as the night begins, he will start moving and make his way to the security office at any time. The player needs to keep an eye on Huggy and see where he's gone off to. Huggy would be one of the fastest characters at the pizzeria. Before you know it, you would be looking at the cameras and then he'd suddenly appear in a doorway. As soon as the player sees Huggy, they would need to close the door immediately, but all of Huggy's advancements wouldn't be the same. Sometimes he would appear in a doorway, and other times it would appear like no one was there, but it would just be Huggy hanging from the ceiling with his long limbs. This would trick the player more times than they'd like. Other times Huggy can be hiding in the darkness, making him seem almost invisible. The player would need to look extra hard and notice Huggy standing there. But if the player can't keep up with all these attempts to enter the security office, then they'll be greeted with a classic Fnaf and Poppy Playtime jump scare. But now we come to another twisted character at Poppy's Pizzeria. But like all animatronics, they weren't always so twisted. Or should I say, mangled. So the next character we're introducing is Mummy Longlegs. Mummy Longlegs was of course modelled after their flexible toy counterpart. Her animatronic body had a number of different features compared to all her other characters. All of her robotic limbs were able to extend and stretch. Her body is also made up of two separate units with her upper torso and lower body. With Mummy's unique design, there was also some problems that the pizzeria would face, especially with her long and flexible limbs. From time to time, they would get all tangled up in each other. Mummy Longlegs wouldn't be able to move for quite some time. She would need the help from someone else to untangle her limbs. And that's where one of the Poppy Pizzeria employees came in. Her name is Stephanie. She would always be there for her and help Mummy get untangled. Stephanie and Mummy Longlegs had quite the connection. The two got on very well, and Stephanie was Mummy's favourite worker. And to a degree, Mummy Longlegs was somewhat of a mother figure to Stephanie as well. But before we get into Mummy Longlegs' tragic incident, let's first look into her role at the pizzeria. So, Mummy Longlegs, like most of the other characters, performed up on stage. In the Playtime band, so far we have Huggy on main vocals and Mummy Longlegs on xylophone. Her long limbs would play the xylophone for all the guests. It fit her character well, seeing that this instrument was somewhat reminiscent of the creepy movements of a spider. So Mummy was considered to be another one of the fan favourites amongst all the characters. But what was her other role when she wasn't up on stage? Well, Mummy Longlegs' other role was that of the daycare attendant. Like most Fazbear pizzerias, there was always a daycare for the younger children. And considering Mummy Longlegs was quite a motherly figure, she fit in perfectly. She would look after all the young children and keep an eye on them and make sure they were safe. As far as the pizzeria was concerned, she was perfect for the job. But there was only one small issue. As we mentioned earlier in the video, sometimes the children would play around with Mummy's long limbs and leave her all tangled up at the end of the day. It was always Stephanie's job to untangle Mummy and make sure she was in working order. But on one unfortunate day, Stephanie wasn't there to fix Mummy's limbs. She had called in sick and wasn't able to come in, but this meant that she wouldn't be able to untangle Mummy. She laid there throughout the whole night wondering where she was. Stephanie should be here by now. As the night went on, Mummy grew more and more impatient. Eventually, she decided to just untangle herself. It couldn't be that hard, could it? Stephanie had done it plenty of times, but Mummy would soon realise that this would be a grave mistake. After hours of trying to untangle herself, she would soon realise the damage that she has done. The next morning, what Stephanie found was quite a frightful sight. What on earth has happened to Mummy Longlegs? Her body was all torn to shreds, and her limbs were all misshapen and damaged. Mummy couldn't stand the sight of her new appearance. She used to be beautiful, but now she was a hideous monster. Mummy was very upset with Stephanie and blamed her for the mangled mess she had become. She was so angry that her next actions became somewhat of a blur. Not much is known about what happened that morning. One day Stephanie was working at the pizzeria, and the next day she wasn't. All the workers were left in the dark about what happened. All they know is that Stephanie was injured in some accident. But the pizzeria refused to disclose what happened, and Stephanie herself wasn't allowed to talk about what happened. But all the while, Mummy Longlegs still dwelled inside the daycare centre. She could never forgive Stephanie for not being there for her. If she didn't abandon her like that, then everything would have been okay. The rage that dwelled inside Mummy Longlegs was starting to spill out. There was one other person who was responsible. Chris the night guard. He was there the night she got all tangled up. At any time Chris could have helped, but he was far too busy dealing with Huggy Wuggy to notice. Regardless of his excuses, Chris needed to pay as well, so eventually Mummy Longlegs would creep out of the daycare centre and make her way towards the security office. Then she'll wait for the perfect time to strike, just when the night guard isn't looking. So now let's get into the gameplay segment of the video. As always, the gameplay loop is based on the classic Fnaf formula of observation and management. So Mummy's starting position would always be in the daycare centre, but the player would have to pay extra attention. Sometimes it looks like she's not there, but if they look closely, Mummy will just be hanging from the ceiling off camera. So the mangled Mummy would make her way towards the security office at around 1 or 2 AM. She would always try to enter from the right hand door. Sometimes the player can see her waiting in the doorway, and other times she'll just be peeking through the window. Sometimes she'll fake out the player by placing a decoy arm through the left hand side door. Mangled Mummy will never be able to go through the left hand side door, but new players who don't know this will still always try to close the door and pay attention to the left hand. And whilst they're occupied with the left hand door, that's when she'll strike through the right. Mummy will also fake out the player in another way. She'll use the old tactic of hanging from the ceiling and making it look like no one's there. The player has to pay attention to her hair, which would be only barely visible. If the player doesn't keep up with all these attempts to enter the office, then they'll be greeted with a classic Fnaf and Poppy Playtime jump scare. So the next character that we're introducing is Boxy Boo. Boxy Boo is of course designed after his toy counterpart. There were quite a few changes to his animatronic version. Instead of springs for arms and legs, he was given tightly coiled metal limbs that would work in the same springy way. He had the special ability to be able to fold up and revert back into his box form. And then he would spring back out and surprise all the guests. Boxy was also given the classic rounded Fazbear teeth so he could appear much more friendly looking towards the children. But it wasn't just the children who could potentially be afraid of Boxy Boo. Chris the Night Guard has always had a fear of Jack-in-the-Boxes ever since he was little. Something about them abruptly popping out of their box always frightened Chris. So this being the case, he would mainly avoid Boxy when he could. But now let's get into Boxy's role at the pizzeria. So Boxy didn't actually perform up on stage with Huggy and Mummy. Instead, he had a different role at the pizzeria. And that role was the birthday surprise performer. So whenever it was a guest's birthday, Boxy would stand at their table and revert back into their box form. The birthday guest would turn his crank and wait for him to jump out and give them a surprise. Sometimes it could take long, sometimes it could be short. It was all a part of the surprise and you never knew when he was going to jump out. But when he would jump out, it would be a surprise for all the kids as they would cheer and laugh. But the only one who wasn't laughing was Chris. He just couldn't put his finger on it, but for some reason he didn't trust Boxy Boo. It's not like he's done anything bad before, but Chris just couldn't help but feel like something was off. Maybe it was his fear of Jack-in-the-Boxes from an early childhood, or maybe it was something else. But unfortunately, in the near future, Chris's suspicions will be proven to be correct. Now let's get into the incident surrounding Boxy Boo. So randomly one day, Boxy reverted back into his box form. But he never popped out again. No matter how much the workers tried to open him up, he wouldn't budge. As the days went by, the pizzeria decided to call in a repair worker. Maybe there was something wrong with Boxy's internal workings. Regardless, they needed to open him up and see what was wrong. So the repair worker came in after hours to check out what was wrong with Boxy. As they tinkered away, they realised that his release spring was faulty. So they swapped it out and attempted to open Boxy. They turned the crank a few times and nothing happened. Maybe there was something still wrong. They go to turn the crank once again and all of a sudden, Boxy bursts out of his box and in a panic, he chomped down on the repair worker's body. Boxy hasn't seen the light of day in some time now, and as soon as he escaped his box, he freaked out. The only thing was, Boxy wouldn't let go of the worker. The worker struggled, but there was no getting Boxy to open his jaws. It seemed like the worker would be stuck there until the next day. When the next day eventually arrived, the workers pried open Boxy's jaw and freed the repair worker. But this wasn't easy to do. They had to dismantle Boxy quickly and get to his internal system override. This meant quickly breaking into Boxy's body and tearing his legs off. Also, in order to get to his jaw mechanism, they had to strip all the material off his face. The workers did a pretty rushed job of taking apart Boxy. When a human life is on the line, they need to act quickly. But this wasn't because Fazbear Entertainment actually cared for the workers' well-being. The greedy company just couldn't have another lawsuit on their hands. So the end result left Boxy looking pretty withered. He couldn't even walk. The withered Boxy had to crawl wherever he went. Also, without his eyes, he couldn't really see well. All he was left with was his infrared lenses. With these lenses exposed, the light was far too intense for him. He could hardly make out what was in front of him. And the only thing he wanted was to get back at that repair worker. If it wasn't for him, Boxy wouldn't be in this state right now. It wasn't Boxy's fault that he clamped down on his body. The repair worker shouldn't have been there in the first place. But now all Boxy wants to do is finish them off. And unfortunately, with their impaired vision, Boxy mistook Chris for the repair worker. Now Boxy will stop at nothing to hunt down who he thinks is the troublesome worker. So now let's get into the gameplay segment of the video. As always, the gameplay loop is based on the classic Fnaf formula of observation and management. So Boxy's starting position would always be in the repair room. He would wait patiently for the right time to strike. His movement can be any time between midnight and 4 AM. So the player would need to keep an eye out for Boxy Boo. He would approach from the right hand doorway. Whenever the player sees Boxy, they would need to shut the door immediately. Sometimes Boxy will be hiding in the dark and all the player can see is his glowing red eyes. There will be some instances where Boxy will already be halfway inside the office. When this happens, the door won't close correctly due to Boxy being in the way. So the player needs to use their flashlight to blind Boxy's infrared lenses and send them back through the door. The bright light would temporarily fry Boxy's vision, and it would be impossible to see where he was. So he would wander off and return when his vision came back to him. But the player needs to keep up with all these attempts to enter the office, because if they don't, they'll be greeted with a classic Fnaf / Poppy Playtime jump scare. But now he comes up against a brand new character at the pizzeria. And this character in particular happens to be the most popular one of all. So the next character we're introducing to Poppy's Pizzeria is Poppy herself. So hence the name with the pizzeria, Poppy is the main mascot. She was considered to be the most popular character at the pizzeria, and this definitely showed when it came to her sales and all of her merch. So Poppy, like all the other characters, was designed after her toy counterpart. She was given her signature blue dress, big blue eyes, and of course, her bright red hair. A neat little feature that the engineers included inside of Poppy's head was that it would let out a mist that was scented like poppy flowers periodically throughout the day. This was a nod to the original doll, whose hair smelled the same as the flower. And to be honest, the scent of Poppy's was much nicer than the smell of greasy pizza and sticky soda-soaked floors. So it would be a surprise to many that Poppy herself doesn't perform up on stage. Instead, she was one of the main characters that walked the floor and greeted all the guests. As the guests entered, she'd be there to say hello. And later in the day, she would walk around the party area. All the guests would love taking photos with Poppy as she walked around. As happy as Poppy made all the guests, she herself didn't feel too happy. When someone is sad, normally they feel like a piece of them is missing. But in Poppy's case, she felt that she had an extra piece, like something was weighing down on her robotic chest. She couldn't explain it. And in a sense, she wasn't wrong about that extra piece. Like we stated in the last videos, each of the animatronic characters at the pizzeria have a bonded toy version of themselves integrated with their endoskeleton. This was a strange request from Playtime Co directly, but as weird as it sounds, the company said it was crucial to have these bonded toys with the animatronics at all times. So Fazbear Entertainment didn't ask any questions and just went along with it. For the most part, pretty much all the animatronics didn't even realise it was there. But when it came to Poppy, she could feel it. It was almost like the doll version of herself was calling out to her, like it wanted to escape, like it yearned to be free. As the days went on, Poppy would go about her day. She would greet the guests and walk around the main party area as usual. Throughout the day, the extra piece of Poppy didn't bother her so much. It was when the day became night that it became a real problem. Poppy knew there was something inside of her chest. Night after night, the extra piece started to change Poppy. There was even times when Poppy would blank out and not remember anything from the previous night. As this went on, it drove the Poppy animatronic insane. Something needed to be done. She couldn't keep feeling this way. The thing inside of her chest had to come out. So one night, Poppy decided to do something about it. She broke into the repair room and prepared to do what needed to be done. But she wouldn't be getting much done with these hands looking like this. She needed something a little more sharp. So she tore off the material from her hands to reveal the sharp metal fingertips underneath. That was more like it. Now it's time to remove the extra piece of Poppy. When all was said and done, Poppy caused a great deal of damage to her body. She had a large tear in her chest with multiple wires hanging out. One of her pigtails fell off, and messing around with the internal wiring caused her eyeball to dislodge out of her socket. But in the end, it was all worth it. She felt so much better. A literal weight has been lifted off her chest. So she finally got a good look at what was inside. It looks just like her. Almost a miniature version of her robotic self. Or was she a robotic version of this little Poppy doll? Regardless, Poppy felt so much better now. But now that the doll was free, a strange sensation came over Poppy. She sprouted razor-sharp teeth and felt a much darker presence come over her. She liked this feeling. She thought this was a feeling everyone should have. Everyone is missing out on such an amazing sensation, and all they need to do is rip out what's inside their chest. One person in particular could really use this, and that was the night guard. As of late, he's been looking really down, and removing what was in his chest would cheer him right up. So Poppy made it her goal to fix the night guard and cheer him up. But who knows if this was really her doing this, or was it something else taking over her? So as Chris the night guard started his shift, Poppy would wait for the perfect time to head down to the security office and fix him. So now let's get into the gameplay segment of the video. As always, the gameplay loop is based on the classic Fnaf formula of observation and management. Poppy's starting position would always be in the main party area. She would make her move at around 2 or 3 AM. So Poppy would appear at the left hand door. The player needs to close it immediately as soon as they see her. Another way that the player could know when Poppy is near is by looking out for the scented mist that Poppy would emit. Whenever the player sees this, they would need to be on high alert. Another attempt that Poppy would make to enter the office would be faking out the player. The player may think that Poppy is gone, but she would be waiting right next to the side of the door and would make a second attempt. On rare occasions at the right hand side door, there would only be the Poppy doll standing there. The player has to look away and wait for her to go away. If they stare at the Poppy doll for too long, it would end in an immediate game over. The player needs to keep up with all these attempts, or else they'll be greeted with a classic Fnaf / Poppy Playtime jump scare. And the next character we're introducing is Banzo Bunny. Banzo Bunny was one of the lesser known toys at Playtime Co., but despite him not being the most popular character in the line of toys, he still had somewhat of a fanbase. And what's more, Fazbear Entertainment thought he would translate to an animatronic perfectly. Freddy's Pizzeria is well known for having bunny-themed characters, and Banzo even had his own inbuilt instrument with the cymbals. So it was only natural to make a Banzo animatronic and get him up on stage. And Banzo's role, to no one's surprise, was the cymbal player. Whilst Mummy and Huggy would play their happy birthday tunes for all the guests, Banzo would chime in here and there with a simple clap of his cymbals. It was simple enough and added some extra fun to the songs they all sung. But there was just one little issue when it came to Banzo. The amount of times he would bash his cymbals just wasn't enough for him. If it was up to Banzo, he would bash them together all day long. Why should his animatronic friends have all the fun? Banzo wanted to be centre stage. Banzo wanted to make as much noise as he could and whenever he wanted. And one day, that's exactly what he did. So it was a regular day as any. Business was as usual, children were running around playing games, parents were sitting down chatting amongst each other, and the Playtime band was up on stage performing. Everything was fine until halfway through their set, all of a sudden Banzo started clapping his cymbals. The guests just thought it was a part of the show. That was until the loud bangs of the cymbals wouldn't stop. For 10 straight minutes, Banzo just kept clapping the cymbals. All the audience and other guests were getting quite annoyed at this point. What on earth was going on? When would this loud banging stop? It was now 15 minutes of the loud banging noise. One of the workers went up on stage and tried to turn off Banzo's power override switch. They flicked the switch and the banging stopped. But only a few seconds later, it started again. How was that even possible? The employee had just turned off his power override. There was no other backup supply power as well. Maybe the animatronic was just experiencing some last minute jitters before it shuts off. But this was definitely not the case. For over 48 hours, the loud banging persisted. The pizzeria had to close its doors until they could solve this problem. Some would just say, why don't they just grab the cymbals off Banzo? The only problem is, Banzo is repeatedly moving his arms, and the cymbals are tightly held in with screws. If the workers hold his moving arms open and unscrew the cymbals, that stress on his moving motors would severely damage all his inner mechanics. For a whole week now, the banging has kept going. What on earth was wrong with Banzo? It's like he'd snapped or something. It's almost like it wasn't him anymore. He would just stand there and move his arms while he stared off into the distance. Chris has been doing his night shift all week with the loud banging noise ringing through his ears. The constant banging sound has driven him mad. He's done everything to stop the sound, but nothing would work. Any more of this constant banging sound and he would surely go beyond insane. All through the night, the banging sound went on, but then suddenly, for the first time in a week, the sound of the cymbals had stopped. What was this? Silence. It's something Chris hasn't heard in days. He went out to the main party area to check it out, and sure enough, Banzo has stopped clapping his cymbals together. It was now or never. Chris had to take this opportunity to take the cymbals off Banzo. While he wasn't moving, Chris could unscrew both of them and take them away. He took the cymbals off Banzo and locked them securely in a locker. Finally, there was peace and quiet. Chris could finally hear his own thoughts. As he made his way back to the office, Banzo turned back on once again. He was quite upset with Chris that he took the cymbals away. Banzo was having so much fun, and that damn night guard took that away from him. Oh well, all Banzo had to do was get them back. Eventually he found out what locker they were locked in. The only thing was, the keys were secured to the night guard's belt, and there was no chance he would ever give them to Banzo. After a while, Banzo came up with the bright idea to tear a hole through the locker. How hard could it be? It would be much easier than stealing the keys off the night guard. That guy was always super quick with shutting those doors to the office. So Banzo began ripping and tearing his way through the locker. As one would imagine, sharp metal and plastic skin wouldn't really go well together. Banzo did a significant amount of damage to his body, and what was worst of all, in trying to get the cymbals back, Banzo had cracked and damaged them severely. Most of his skin has been ripped off his metal endoskeleton, and shards of the metal cymbals are lodged in his face and ears. These things were trashed. There's no way they would work ever again. The one thing that gave Banzo joy was now destroyed, and this wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for that damn night guard. Banzo decided that Chris would have to pay for what he has done to the precious cymbals, and this time, he'd have to be extra quick if he wants to keep up with Banzo. So now let's get into the gameplay segment of the video. As always, the gameplay loop is based on the classic Fnaf formula of observation and management. So Banzo's starting position would always be on the main stage, and he would make his move from 12 AM onwards. So Banzo was one of the fastest moving characters at the pizzeria. He would be able to appear from both the right and left hand doorway. The player needs to be extra careful of Banzo. He would charge up to the doorway as fast as he could. It would be up to the player to spot him running on the cameras and close it before he gets there. Once this happens, Banzo would then return back to the stage. Banzo will also try to sneak up on the player. Sometimes he'll wait just outside the door and intentionally move in when the player checks the camera feed. In this instance, the player needs to look out for the party hat through the window. They would then need to close the door and then check the cameras. The player needs to be careful and stay on guard, because if they don't, they'll be greeted with a classic Fnaf / Poppy Playtime jump scare.